All right, we're on. Okay, and oops.
Hey.
Hey, Larry.
Okay. Get a little more light here.
Let me unmute me though. Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to the May 2022 edition of 5 Miles from Anywhere, the International Sherlock Holmes Society. Today, we've got a few announcements to start with, but of course the reason you're all here is our wonderful Sherlockian visitor guest today, Hal Glatzer, who's going to give his presentation on Doyle's Dozen. Really looking forward to that. And then at the end of his presentation, we'll have some time for some discussion, probably some questions for him as well. Okay. So announcements, a couple of things. I kind of categorize this with events and then some kind of publishing ones. First of all, there's going to be KidsCon in New England. So anybody in the New England area on May 21st in Concord, New Hampshire. They're going to have a con, and I know, Brian, you're going to have a booth there. He'll have a little Sherlock Holmes booth with some of the Belanger Books publications. And of course, everyone who's in that area is welcome to stop by and say hello. So hopefully, if you are, please go ahead and do that. Other event, another New Hampshire event here. Very excited that Keene, New Hampshire is going to have a Sherlock Holmes Week event at the public library. And so at that event, there's going to be some plays that they're going to perform by the Edge Ensemble Theater Company. But all that week from July 18th to 24th, there's going to be daily Sherlock Holmes activities. It's going to be really cool. If anyone's going to be in that area like early for the BSI conference, which is at a week after, highly recommend swinging by, especially that weekend, because this is where you're going to see where they're going to do the play performances. And it's Sherlock Holmes Not According to Doyle. They did a play of the Sherlock Holmes Goes West by Mark Twain, The Unique Hamlet by Vincent Starrett. They did one of my stories, which I'm pretty excited about. Yes, Virginia, there's a Sherlock Holmes. And then also a Solar Pond story, The Adventure of the Late Mr. Faversham. So if you can, highly recommend seeing it. And if you're unavailable, I believe the audio recordings, because they're kind of more like radio plays, will be available online at the Edge Theater Ensemble's website. But very, very exciting. It'll be awesome. And of course, the big event for the summer, which I'm sure all of you already know about, is the BSI July Conference, Sherlock Holmes in the British Empire. That is going to be in New York. If you don't have information, I didn't put much on it because I figured everyone already knew about it, but if you do need information, just Google BSI July Conference and you'll get all the information. Reservations, I believe, are available or going to be soon, and you want to check it out. So unfortunately, I got to go to work, so I can't go to the conference. I was so crushed. But really, it looks like it'll be a fantastic conference. Ross Davies put together an amazing a group of panels, and just going to be wonderful. So if you can go, and I'm sure a lot of you guys will be going, enjoy it. Say hi to everyone on my behalf. All right. I think that's all the events I have. And now just a couple of other publishing pieces. Jay Ganguly, one of the board members of 5 Miles from Anywhere, wanted us to know that her proceedings of the Pondicherry Lodge, which is the Sherlock Holmes Society of India's journal, is accepting submissions. The deadline's May 15th, but she said just mention that, you know, you're part of 5 Miles from Anywhere, and she'll extend it for you till May 20th. And so it's a wonderful journal. It's an online only journal. But usually it's, I mean, when she published it, it's like 200 pages each issue, and they're awesome. Some really nice articles in those, and I highly recommend, if you are interested in writing some Sherlock Holmes scholarship, send something in, and Jay's wonderful to work with. Also, the next MX anthology, However Improbable, which will be featuring stories with traditional Holmes and Watson stories that initially seem impossible, like maybe they have a ghost in them, but they always end up with some rational solutions. So Holmes and Watson stay Holmes and Watson, they're traditional. So those are, there's openings to submit to that. The deadline's June 30th. And you can send those in to the papers of Sherlock Holmes at gmail.com. David Markham's the editor. All the money goes to Undershaw, and they've raised like $100,000 for Undershaw, which is now has a special needs school in there. And also, it's just a wonderful nonprofit. That's where Doyle wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles. So definitely consider it, and you'll know you're supporting a really great cause. All right, and lastly, for submissions, my own publishing, Belanger Books, we've got quite a few submission calls out there. If you're interested in writing a Sherlock Holmes story or some Solar Pond scholarship, we have the Pontine Dossier, which is our annual journal of Solar Pond scholarship. We also have an H.P. Lovecraft Sherlock Holmes anthology, a consultation Sherlock Holmes, which is traditional, and then a crossover Sherlock Holmes and Father Brown anthology. So if you are interested in submitting, you can just go to Belanger Books and go to the submissions tab, and we'd love to hear from you. All right, and the last thing before we get started with our talk is that we are going to be taking a hiatus. All of the board members, since now we can travel, are going to be traveling internationally for the next few months. And I will be, this is where I will be for all of June in Noosa Heads, Australia, right near Brisbane on the coast. So there won't be a meeting in June and July. Although Jay Ganguly, I believe, will be at the BSI conference in July. So if you do get this chance to see her, say hello in person and introduce yourselves as a member of 5 Miles from Anywhere, because she is one of our board members. She'd love to say hi to you. But we'll be back in August with a talk, 62 is True, the Case for an Expanded Canon. I'll give that talk. I won't say right now what the stories I'm going to argue should fit in, but I'll make a case to add 2 additional pieces to the canon, and I will explain why I think they fit. So that's what's coming up in August. Feel free, though, please send emails, connect over the summer. I'd love to hear when we come back in August. If any of you guys have had any adventures or pictures from the BSI conference, would be awesome to share. And we can talk a little about those next meeting. Okay. All right. And here he is, Mr. Glatzer himself. So Hal Glatzer, is an author and performer. He is known for his mysteries and for his music performances. Some of his Sherlockian work includes a play, Sherlock Holmes, The Volcano Horror. It's a stage play produced and recorded in Hilo, Hawaii. And also the story, The Adventure of Baron Maupertuis, featured in the Nefarious Villains of Sherlock Holmes Volume 1. You can read more about Hal, as well as hear some of his musical performances by visiting halglatzer.com. And in fact, I highly recommend it. He's a very, very talented musician, as well as a talented writer. And he's also done other mysteries as well. But definitely check out his website. It's got an awesome bio on him, and some of his performances, and also some of his books that he's written. All right. So without much further ado, let me give a warm welcome to Hal. And you're on, sir. So yay.
Okay. Well, it's nice to see you all. Shout out to Steve Mason and the crew of the Bark Lone Star. for having hosted this presentation a few months back. It's a real pleasure to do this. I'm not getting my next slide. I'm sorry to say. I'm hitting my.
Click on the screen or click the tab or the space bar. But if sometimes you click on the screen, you'll get it.
There we go. Okay. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle was once confronted with having to make kind of Sophie's choice. Which of your children do you love the most? I hope you will forgive my allusion to William Styron's famous novel by conflating short works of fiction with human offspring, but it is true that Conan Doyle was asked which of the 56 short stories he wrote about Sherlock Holmes were his personal favorites, and he replied with a list of 12. According to a 1999 article in the Strand magazine, here is Conan Doyle's list with the dates of their original publication. The Adventure of the Speckled Band, 1892, The Red-Headed League, 1891, The Adventure of the Dancing Men, 1903, The Final Problem, 1893, Scandal in Bohemia, 1891, The Adventure of the Empty House, 1903, The Five Orange Pips, 1891, The Adventure of the Second Stain, 1904, The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, 1910, The Adventure of the Priory School, 1904, The Musgrave Ritual, 1893, and the same year, The Rygate Puzzle. As far as I know, he did not give reasons for his choices. They are traditionally presented in this order, which may mean that his most favored favorite is on top and his least favored favorite at the bottom, but that seems awkward. I prefer to think that he merely named them and did not intend to rank them. So I will talk briefly about each story, saying whether and to what extent I agree with Conan Doyle's choices. I assume you all have your own favorites because you have read all the stories, but just in case you have not, please be aware spoilers are inevitable. We have always known that when Conan Doyle first began writing about Holmes, he never imagined how popular his creation would become, nor did he expect the ongoing demands from fans and publishers to turn out more and more stories. In The Final Problem, published in 1893, he famously killed off Holmes to get out from under the burden. But a decade later, he yielded to the pressure and brought Holmes back from the dead. Well, maybe he did so reluctantly, but it's worth noting that 5 of his 12 favorite stories are among those that he wrote after the resurrection. So here is my take on each of Conan Doyle's 12 favorite stories. The Adventure of the Speckled Band is extremely popular. In that same 1999 article, The Strand polled its readers, asking them to choose and rank their favorites, and this story came in at number 1. It does have a lot going for it. A spooky old house, a mysterious death in the night, a frightened young woman, a unique murder weapon, and a dastardly villain hoist with his own petard. Unfortunately, as I think everyone knows by now, it is also absurd. In the real world, the murder weapon simply does not work. Holmes prides himself on being ignorant of things that he considers irrelevant to his work, like the Copernican model of the solar system. But even if Conan Doyle never paid attention in college to natural history lectures about reptiles, couldn't he have asked someone about snakes? They can see with their eyes and smell with their tongues, but they have no ears. A whistle in the dark cannot attract a snake's attention, and they can't climb down a rope either. If anyone ever pointed this out to Conan Doyle, and if he was embarrassed by the facts, we'll never know. But it's one of his favorites, and in the words of Tony Soprano, what you gonna do? The Red-Headed League, by contrast, is not only one of Conan Doyle's favorites and one of my favorites, it is probably one of everybody's favorites. The basic plot has been mined and mimicked in dozens, maybe hundreds of books and movies since 1891. The device of distracting someone so they don't notice a criminal enterprise right under their nose is brilliantly executed here. And this is one of the rare stories in which Holmes does not solve a crime after the fact, but rather prevents it from being committed. The Adventure of the Dancing Men is chock full of things to like. Holmes not only figures out what happened, he also prevents a further crime from happening, and he solves a puzzle. Now, I'll bet that it was this story that first showed most of us how to use frequency analysis to crack substitution ciphers. And perhaps some of us still use the same brute force method to solve the cryptograms that show up in the newspapers. The cipher plot is also nicely joined to the backstory of a jealous American gangster and the woman who thought she'd escaped from him. Now, before I get into the final problem, I'd like to mention one of Doyle's near contemporaries, another man named Arthur. The slightly older Arthur Sullivan felt that composing laugh-a-minute theater pieces with lyricist William S. Gilbert was taking too much time away from the symphonic and choral compositions which he believed would be his legacy. But as it turned out, somewhere in the world, right now, a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta is being performed. Conan Doyle likewise felt that writing the Holmes stories distracted him from writing grand, epic, and patriotic novels for which he expected to be best remembered. And yet, somewhere in the world, right now, somebody is reading a Sherlock Holmes mystery. They have never gone out of print. And there are myriad translations. Here are some paperbacks in French, Portuguese, Hungarian, and Turkish. Holmes is in comic books, graphic novels too. No matter how or where you first find Sherlock Holmes, the odds are that, as Conan Doyle discovered, Sherlock Holmes stays with you all your life. So, on to the final problem. I don't much care for it. It's an adventure story, not really mysterious. It does have Holmes in disguise sufficient to baffle Watson, but the story doesn't show Holmes doing what he does best, detecting. And of course, as an attempt to bid farewell to Holmes, it failed miserably. I think it's significant that The Adventure of the Empty House, in which he brought Holmes back to life, is also one of Conan Doyle's 12 favorites. Maybe he was finally persuaded by entreaties from fans and publishers. Maybe he just liked the money that Holmes continued to earn for him so that in old age he could finance his obsession with spiritualism. We'll never know. But The Empty House is a much better story than The Final Problem. Once again, we get Holmes in a disguise that Watson can't see through, but the plot is suspenseful, and Holmes devises a clever ruse to make the villain show his hand. But it's not one of my favorite stories. I think it's weighed down by requiring Holmes to tell Watson how he survived Moriarty's attack at the Falls and explain where he has been all this time afterward. We're expected to believe that Holmes, alias Mr. Sigerson, trekked all the way to Tibet and hung out with the Dalai Lama? Come on! Holmes had never been involved with or intrigued by any kind of religion, and his journey to the East does not seem to have produced a spiritual awakening. Nor have his travels really broadened his crime-solving skills. He had always been able to recognize foreign tattoos and tobaccos. Holmes returns to London the same man he was before. For me, the bottom line is, if Conan Doyle had not tried to kill him off in The Final Problem, he would not have needed to so crudely pad the adventure of the adventure of the empty house. By contrast, A Scandal in Bohemia is another story that it's fair to say everybody loves, and almost certainly because of its wily heroine. The talented Miss Adler is a marvelous creation. It's not surprising that so many subsequent pastiche stories involve her or a character very much like her. The first all-female Scion Society, as you know, was called in her honor the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes. I have met dozens of women over the years who say that Ms. Adler and A Scandal in Bohemia were what launched them into Sherlockian fandom. Now, I don't know whether Miss Adler herself called herself Irene or Irane, but Watson says Holmes calls her the woman, the only woman whom he truly respects, for she has gotten the better of him in a duel of wits. Watson almost gives her the last word, saying, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," as she passes him by in the street, demonstrating that she knows it was he who was disguised in her house. Misogyny was commonplace among even the smartest of Victorian men, and Conan Doyle tends to depict women as weaker than men. Several of them swoon, and most cannot save themselves from danger. They need to be rescued by men. Miss Adler is the counterexample to these stereotypes, and she does indeed make the woman unique. Now, I'd like to preface my discussion of the next story by pointing out that there are other mystery genres besides the classic whodunit. There is the howdunit, such as The Problem of Thor Bridge, and the subgenre of howdunits known as the locked room puzzle, such as The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. And then there is the why-done-it, and one of Doyle's dozen, The Five Orange Pips, is a why-done-it. In a why-done-it, we enter in medias res, in the middle of the tale, and we are led through to the exposure of the killer, but that's not the end of the story, because we don't know how it all began. The real plot of a why-done-it is its backstory, through which we learn the motivation behind the crime. The Dancing Men is a why-done-it, because even after the cryptogram is deciphered, the murder makes sense only when we learn why events transpired as they did. But the structure of most why-done-its is something of a dodge. The author doesn't need to make a character's actions believable because we don't yet know his motivation. Indeed, the entire second halves of two novels are their backstories, without which the murders in the first halves make no sense. In A Study in Scarlet, of course, Holmes can describe the appearance of a killer from his handwriting in blood. And in The Valley of Fear, he can winkle a killer from his hiding place after fishing a dumbbell out of a moat. But Holmes cannot discover a backstory on his own. He has to interview the killer after he's caught. I feel it's a little too easy to pull off a why-done-it. So that kind of story doesn't automatically rank very high with me. Unlike the novels, though, The Five Orange Pips is short, which helps us to forget how artificial the why-done-it structure really is. Now, there is a sort of backstory to The Adventure of the Second Stain, but it's handled better, being nicely combined with a whodunit and a howdunit. While Holmes is drawn into what starts as an espionage case and a murder is mentioned only casually, Holmes sees a connection and employs many of his best skills to uncovering it. The murder plot, I must admit, seems a little forced. The jealous, raging madwoman must have been a cliche even in Conan Doyle's time. But the justification for Holmes concealing the involvement of an upper-class woman, however disconcerting to modern readers, does emerge logically from the setup. As any of you know who have seen my play Sherlock Holmes and the Volcano Horror, I am particularly fond of The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. I shamelessly adapted it and moved the action from Cornwall to Kilauea Volcano on the island of Hawaii. I lived on that island in Hilo for many years. In both places, There is a semi-wild natural setting that encourages a woo-woo factor, the possibility of an inexplicable, malignant, and possibly even otherworldly force at work. The story moves right along, proceeds with an inexorable logic as each new fact is brought to light, and the denouement shows a side of Holmes's nature that comes out in only a few other stories. Holmes considers some murders to be justified under the circumstances, and he is willing to conceal the murderer from the law in the name of a higher moral authority. In this story, I especially like Watson's willingness to join Holmes in what he knows to be a dangerous experiment with, what else to call it, a psychedelic drug. Look, I'm a baby boomer. I have plenty of experience in that regard, but I liked The Devil's Foot long before I ever smoked pot or dropped acid. I would call The Adventure of the Priory School a tragedy rather than a mystery. It's good to know that Holmes can trace bicycle tire tracks as well as he can trace footprints, but it seems a terrible shame that a teacher should lose his life in pursuit of a runaway boy. The biggest problem I have with the Priory School, however, with apologies to the Priory Scholars Scion Society, by the way, the biggest problem I have with the Priory School is that the perpetrator is another cliche character, a young man passed over for inheritance who revenges himself on the rightful heir, and wouldn't you know, he's illegitimate. Look, bastards were stock villains from well before Shakespeare, right through to 19th century melodrama, which, I'm sorry to say, is what the Priory School is. Now, when I was young, reading the Holmes story for the first, second, or third time, the Musgrave Ritual was my favorite. It's a treasure hunt, and treasure hunts are always exciting. In lieu of a map, Conan Doyle gives us a riddle, and to solve it, Holmes needs to draw not only on logic, but on trigonometry. Another offbeat and memorable aspect of the story is that the treasure, while certainly worth money, turns out to be far more valuable as a historical artifact. The more often I read the story, however, and especially as I grew older, I saw that it was seriously flawed. The setup requires a servant to be smarter than his master, and well, that's been a cliche of comedy since ancient Greece, and not to mention the Marriage of Figaro. So I came to wonder why Brunton, I'll go back. I need to go back there. There we go. I came to wonder why Brunton would let himself be fired and go off on his treasure hunt with only the illiterate maid to help him. If he were really, if he were really that smart, when Musgrave catches him in the library, he would have shown him his interpretation of the ritual. They'd have found the treasure together and split the reward. Of course, in that case, nobody would have needed Sherlock Holmes. I have to admit that when I saw the Rygate puzzle on the list, I didn't remember it. I had to take up the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes and reread it. One of the sources for Conan Doyle's lists gives the title of this story as The Rygate Squires, which, it seems to me, is more appropriate since two country squires, father and son, are at the heart of the mystery. The story is fairly clever, but the squires are cardboard cutouts. One is old and doddering, the other is young and hot-headed. They're not really well established enough as characters to justify their actions. Feuding with a neighbor over a land boundary is what caused them to commit their crimes. But we learn that only from the neighbor. Holmes does not discover it. In compensation for these weaknesses, however, we get Holmes deducing how the message was handwritten, which is similar to his explication of the handwritten warning in The Glorious Scot. And he stages a ruse to distract the perps long enough for him to find the missing paper. To solve the Rygate puzzle, Holmes employs all of his talents except for disguise. So for me, it's a satisfactory story, but not a great one. And with that, I conclude my take on Conan Doyle's favorite stories. But I have to ask, shouldn't there have been one more? How can Conan Doyle have failed to include the story that I believe most Sherlockians today rank among his greatest? Indeed, the Strand's readers put it in their pantheon. Where, I ask, is the story with that famously pithy remark? I'm sure you all recognize the dialogue illustrated in this scene. Is there any point to which you would wish to draw my attention? But to the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident, remarked Sherlock Holmes. We will never know why Conan Doyle did not consider Silver Blaze one of his favorites, but as Holmes always says, in so many stories and in so many words, we must not theorize before we possess all the facts, and we must never guess. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Hal, for the wonderful talk. And I think, well, I'm sure you've given us lots to talk about. There is one thing I do want to bring up, though. He did explain his choices. He wrote in the Strand, because this was a contest to see if the people in the Strand, or the readers, could guess his dozen. And then he published it and explained why he did each one, and also said why he didn't include like later stories. So he said they hadn't had a chance to percolate yet. So he does actually have, it's a few page article. I'll send it to you. It was in the
thanks.
link.
I'd appreciate that. I'll add it to my presentation.
Yeah, because I had sent it out to the group. I thought I'd include you on it, a link to it, because it's on the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia website. But let's jump in. Who would, I'm sure, so basically just either unmute and jump in, but if it gets a little too rowdy, I can start checking hand raisings and things like that. Any questions or comments from Hal to start with? Oh, Sandy's got one right now.
I have one question on why he didn't do Silver Blaze, although that's one of my favorites. I can understand his feeling when he realized and was told that he had made some rather bad mistakes about how horse racing is conducted. In other words, he realized there was a major flaw in that plot. And once it was published, there was nothing he could do about it. I could understand, had I been in that position, that I might not have put that among the fondest of my works.
Yes, that is true. I've heard that as well, but he didn't express the same regret over the Speckled Band.
Maybe he didn't realize or didn't care. But here, horse racing and the British, it's the kind of thing he kind of should have known. You know,
that's what I think. I think horse racing is so universal in England that it was really embarrassing. But you can make up a weird snake from a foreign country in the Victorian period and just make it up. And so I think because horse racing was like so known, that's why it was so embarrassing.
Okay.
I'm not sure he ever had a reaction to the snake criticism. You know, we had one. I think that may have been after the fact.
Yeah,
by Sherlockians later, years later, after he was already gone.
Just to order things here, Olivia and then Shayna for questions.
Oh, I was going to make the same comment about the Speckled Band versus Silver Blaze, because surely there must have been some herpetologist who wrote to Conan Doyle and went, sir, good sir. And it's not that Conan Doyle also necessarily cared about errors and facts in other of his works. Isn't there a quote about railroad tracks where he said, if there are no points, I make up the points, or something like that?
Mhm.
And yet that didn't And yet somehow that doesn't disqualify those other stories, but disqualify Silver Blaze. I don't know. It seems like a strange bit of hypocrisy, personally. On the other hand, the Swamp Adder is a unique, if we're playing the game, a snake that is canon within the existing Sherlockian universe. So I suppose you could make up biology about it, though maybe this snake does drink milk, but I don't know. Who's to say? But I still think you should have put Silver Blaze on the list because it's just such an incredibly good story.
Okay, Shayna.
Yeah, speaking of Speckled Band, not only did Conan Doyle, apparently not mind the herpetological irregularities, he kind of doubled down by choosing that as a story that he adapted for the stage.
Yes.
And was very indignant when people said that, oh, the snake face. Say, no, we used a real snake, for the denouement, and apparently the snake did not always cooperate, which led to some awkwardness.
And then when they used a fake snake, they commented about how realistic it was. Just hysterical. The snake's just laying there like, what is going on? I don't.
I expect the snake on stage did not do what horses on stage are known to do.
I think the difference between the snake and the horse racing is that there are no herpetologists in the story. Spouse Watson was writing this story, and Watson spent half his own pay on racing. How could Watson, who went to the races all the time, make this mistake? Know that a horse that doesn't look anything like the horse that's registered is allowed to race under that name. I mean, how would Watson possibly make that mistake? So that hurts, when you make something that's that big a goof. And that's the way I look at it anyway.
I think it's the famous remark, quote unquote, that makes the Silver Blaze such a success, is that it completely counterintuitive response and exchange that just stands out above practically every other quote from the canon. There's no surprise it was used as the title of a Broadway play.
And novel. Excellent novel too. Steve Mason.
Al, as always, I enjoyed the talk. The one thing I'm going to defend Doyle on is on the Speckled Band, that I fortunately had a biology professor in college who loved the Speckled Band. And so we actually studied it. The University of Cincinnati several years ago actually did discover that there are certain types of boa constrictors and other type of snakes that can climb up and down a rope. It's not easy, but they were able to show that they could do it. And then in terms of the whistle, you are correct. Snakes don't have ears, but they also have found through studies that if the whistle is low enough and actually sets off a vibration, the snake can actually react to the vibration within their head. And so I think Doyle was just ahead of his time, that he knew that these things were going to be discovered 100 years later and wrote about them. So.
As of course, if the snake had been a constrictor, it would have been easy to discover that the woman had not simply died, but it would have been obvious that she'd been squeezed to death.
Right. Well, and that's why at the end of it, when when Watson and Holmes walks in there, it's wrapped around its head. It's going to constrict against its own master, I guess.
Yeah. But it's portrayed as the venomous snake in the context of the story.
Does anyone know if there are snakes that are constrictors and also have poison and inject poison? Are there any? I don't know. Does anybody know?
I don't know.
I don't know, but generally speaking, it's one or the other in terms of how snakes are ambush predators. And so it's either one or the other.
But boa constrictors are not venomous or poisonous. They can bite and their bites hurt, but even their bites aren't even necessarily lethal to humans. They would just really hurt. So no.
So according to Google, which Google knows everything, there are a few snakes that do both constrict and have venom. Not much. There's
Maybe
a
we
South
could move on.
American, there's a South American rear fang colubrid, whatever that is, and in North American colubrids, like the garter snake and some other things that, but none of them would be real lethal either way. So
I was gonna say some snakes that are like venomous to small animals are non-lethal to humans, kind of like spiders.
Right.
Like it depends on the toxic and potency of the venom. So
Maybe the swamp
Maybe we
adders like the platypus. It's just, we can't define.
exactly. A platypus? Harry the platypus.
Platypuses glow in the dark, it turns out, glow under ultraviolet.
Really?
Maybe
Yeah.
we should talk about some other stories and leave the snakes and the horses to their own devices.
Robin, our tour guide here, our Sherlockian tour guide from England, you've got a question.
Oh no, I was just about to say that the boa species that do have venom, it's more in the way of a heavy sedative, like you might get at the dentist. It's not intended to damage the prey, just to suppress it.
So the next time you go to the dentist, instead of getting a needle out but dentist whips out a boa constrictor.
Hmm.
This will numb me up, right?
I don't think my insurance would cover that.
Hal, you were pretty critical about some of Doyle's choices. I mean, some probably surprised me. Like I was surprised you criticized, Final or Rygate, because those are two of my favorites. I'm just wondering, what are some choices you think? You mentioned Silver Blaze. Or some others that you were like, well, Doyle, you should have included these. Are there any that come to mind?
Well, as far as the original texts in the canon, I think the novels are really my favorites. I think the short stories are great, and many of them are extremely good. But I never really thought much about creating my own dozen of favorites. Part of this is, of course, because I also am a writer, and I'm looking. A lot of what you heard in my critique is an author's criticism, not necessarily a detective's criticism or something like that. My three published novels are set in another time. They're historical mysteries set in the years just before the Second World War, for which I've done a lot of research, particularly in the musical milieus of the time where my heroine lives. And so I have a lot of opinions about historical fiction, and I can treat the canon nowadays as historical fiction. I've written some pastiches. Derek and Brian have published one about Baron Maupertuis in The Nefarious Villains, Volume 1. David Markham, thank you, David, has published one last year and has got two more coming out in this year's MX anthology. And I always try to avoid anachronisms, some of which, it must be said, are inevitable. You just have to tell modern readers things about the past that people actually living at that time would not have needed to be told. Like there's horse shit in the streets and things like that. At least if it relates to the story, if somebody slips and falls. But so a lot of my critiques are really not so much about the stories and their relationship to Conan Doyle's own life's work, but really more about the structure of the story, the need to have a certain amount of exposition up front. Yes, I should ring off here and let other people talk.
Shayna, and then Brian, do you have something too?
Yep.
Okay, so Shayna.
Yeah, I was a little dubious about the inclusion of the Priory Scholar. I suspect that a big part of why Conan Doyle picked particular stories is like if they had a really good hook. And I have to admit that for each of the stories on the list, he'd be like, oh yeah, that's the one with fill in the blank. And for Priory Scholars, I suspect, for me, like, oh yeah, that's the one with the horseshoes. So I think that's why it made the list, because everyone I think remembers that detail.
Isn't that also the story where it opens with a guy passing out on their bearskin hearthrug?
Very good entrance as well. That's a very good
Yes.
point. Excellent client entrance. Very dramatic. And I know like people have argued about the bicycle tracks thing, like, if you could determine which way a bicycle was going. I think under certain conditions you could, but I'm not going to open up that can of worms right now. We don't have time.
This week on Mythbusters.
Brian,
If one
Yes.
tire is worn more than the other, then you can see which track will go on top of the other. But if the two tires are the same, I don't think you could ever tell.
I feel like with this discussion, we're just spinning our wheels.
Oh.
Oh. When you read Doyle's article on why he picked the stories he did, one of the first things he says is that if they hadn't just basically come out, that the Lion's Mane and the Illustrious Client would be on the list, which means that the last two he picked, Musgrave Ritual and Rygate Squires, would not. Do we all think that Lion's Mane and Illustrious Client should be on the list?
Illustrious Client, yes. Lion's Mane, no.
I concur.
Well, there you have it. Okay.
well, the only
See you in August.
I guess the one thing about Lion's Mane, it would be that it does tell us about the retirement. And so if you want the full picture as part of the, do you want the 12 to show kind of the full scope from Musgrave Ritual all the way to Lion's Mane, I could see that being an argument that Doyle could make.
Also a derivative of the Speckled Band, the trick of.
You're right, it's another death clue, another death clue story.
And it doesn't have Watson.
The only good version of the Lion's Mane is Burt Cole's radio play, which is magnificent. Mm-hmm. Oh, is my sound okay?
There is
It
an
is
echo
now.
for a second, but it's fine now.
Okay, but digital.
It's fine now.
Okay, but
Right.
digital.
Tom, did you want to jump in?
I want to throw in a vote for the three Garridebs. And the reason is that's the only story where Holmes was actually shown to have deep feelings for Watson, where he literally told the perpetrator that he would have killed him if he had hurt Watson. And that was such a departure from the cold, calculating, even cruel Holmes at times. He did treat Watson shamefully from time to time. And, that's always stuck in my mind as a unique piece of the Sherlock saga.
Yeah.
Definitely one of the great moments. What kind of moment make a story? A great story. I mean, it's a great moment. I Am Bertie Edwards is a great moment in the Valley of Fear. Does that make it a great story?
And what's wrong with that story that always leaves me with a bad taste is that this poor innocent guy who collects junk goes crazy. And I mean, why couldn't he have just been a little upset? It really bothers me that he goes crazy.
Tom, I think for some reason the echo is coming from you. That's why I keep kind of muting you. But if you want to unmute now and make a comment, go for it.
The curious incident of the dog in the night.
Oh, now you muted yourself, I think. Not sure. Are you trying to talk still, Tom? Looks like he's trying to unmute. All right. All right. Oh, there you typed it. The curious instant is a moment. That's true. That's a very good point. Any other questions? Because we're actually getting close to the end here for Hal about his comments, his research, the dozen itself.
I'd like to know what people think of the lion's mane. Because personally, jellyfish actually freak me out, but it's a fascinating story.
I don't know what poisonous jellyfish looks like a lion's mane. I'm no more a herpetologist than I am an expert in other invertebrates. I know from Portuguese men of war, and I know from what they call box jellyfish, which plague the islands of Hawaii, the beaches on the islands of Hawaii. But I've never actually seen a picture of something that if someone looked at it, they would say, wow, that looks like the mane of a male lion. Has anybody ever seen it? I never have.
Nancy, you want to jump in there?
There's actually a jellyfish called a lion's mane.
Yeah.
It's a real thing, and they have them in aquariums, and they look kind of poofy like a lion's mane.
Okay.
And they're huge.
Thank you.
I bet they stink like a lion's mane as well.
I'm afraid I have to go to another another appointment. I'm sad. Hate to drag myself away from this, but I will see you all at the next 5 Miles meeting. I'm so sorry I haven't been at the last couple of ones. I've been sick and busy. But until then, everybody take care of themselves and have a wonderful rest of your week. And bye, guys.
Bye-bye, Olivia.
Bye.
Okay, Nancy and Shayna.
I just spoke up. I think I stepped over somebody else, and I apologize. I thought you called me earlier. So I just wanted to say that about the lion's mane. That really is a real jellyfish.
Gotcha. Okay, Shayna?
At 221 BCon last month, I don't know who started this, but there was like a Sherlockian fist bump happening where you do the fist bump and then you do lion's mane away.
Nice.
I think the difficulty of ranking these stories, and Larry, you mentioned this earlier too, like when you criticize a story, every Sherlock Holmes story is somebody's favorite. And so, suddenly, you think that this is not a story that people like, and suddenly you're maybe not doing a fist bump, but actually a Sherlockian fist fight at 221 BCon. But there's always some, unique stories, and I'm sure a lot of us are part of Science Societies where we read a story a month, and each time you look at it, sometimes it becomes your one of your top, just because it's fresh in your mind. And so, I just think that's something to always consider here. Hal, you mentioned Thor Bridge. I think that's an excellent one as well, and that's one interesting because that's based on, inspired by true event mystery, and so that's even possibly another genre that Doyle was working in. So many that he started or was early in. Larry.
Speaking of inspired by true events, when I was researching a story that David is publishing this year, which is set in the Netherlands, I discovered that in the middle of the 19th century, the king of the Netherlands was widowed and became widower, and a search was launched for a successor wife to be the queen consort. And while the search was going on, the king had a morganatic affair with a French opera singer. And I note in the context of the story I wrote, Holmes says, I was reminded of this when I was working with the King of Bohemia, and I wonder if Conan Doyle had looked into this and was similarly reminded of that when he was creating Irene Adler and the King of Bohemia.
Larry, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I guess I just wanted to respond to what Tom said about, because Tom was responding to something that I said. And basically that even in Silver Blaze, Holmes is, that, what can I wish to draw your attention to? Strange Affairs of Dog in Nighttime is also just a moment, but it's also the crux of the mystery. And there's really so many other things about Silver Blaze that's just a lot of fun. The whole business with, your murderer is right there next to you and right behind you. And it's just a lot of really interesting, funny characters and stuff. The whole his relationship with his client, who keeps criticizing him for not doing much, or doesn't seem to be getting, just a lot of elements of Silver Blaze that just make it a great story. It's just too bad, that Doyle didn't understand racetrack stuff, and it does burn because we think of Watson being a racetrack guy, but he thought that he made up for it in Shoscombe Old Place, which also had a racing aspect to it. But of course, that's not nearly as fun a story as the other one is. So there's good stories. The only thing, one of my general responses just to Hal's lecture completely is that biological correctness is not necessarily the measure of a good Sherlock Holmes mystery story, but that's just me.
All right, and we are pretty much out of time here. Was there anybody else who wanted to jump in, or did I think I got everyone, but if I didn't, please correct me. All right. Hal, thank you so much. Another round of applause for Hal. You just did a fantastic job. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you, and I'll make sure I send you the actual article Doyle wrote about
Yes.
Bill Dozen. And I think this was just a really fun talk. It always is. It always goes by pretty quick. And I always wish, we try to keep it pretty tight with the hour. But I almost always wish we could just keep going forever. So, buddy. And we will see you back in August. Everyone have a wonderful time for the summer and late spring. Enjoy some great Sherlockian events and see some people. And I will be back in front of you, hopefully with you all in August. But thank you all. Thank you again to Hal. And a wonderful few months away, people. And I'll see you in August. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.